Bungie just revealed a lot of big sandbox changes coming to Destiny 2 Beyond Light on November 10th. These changes include changes to general weapon archetypes like hand cannons and auto rifles, and specific weapons like Falling Guillotine and the Mountaintop. Starting off with hand cannons, Bungie says they're making changes to give hand cannon subfamilies more diversity and more reasons to use each. Starting with aggressive hand cannons, they've increased the rate of fire from 110 to 120, and they've broke out aggressive hand cannons, allowing for custom tuning. They've said, for example, damage fall off for 100 range in the subfamily now starts at 32 meters. So ultimately, this is the reveal of the 110 buff that they've been talking about for a while in past TWABs. I think this is a really good, welcome change because people really don't use 110s like the Duke or Criminal's Dagger in Crucible, and I think this will change that. Also, I think that this huge buff to damage fall off that they're talking about will really make this competitive with weapons like Gnawing Hunger and pulse rifles like Vigilance Wing that are currently dominating the Crucible meta. Next, on adaptive and precision frame hand cannons, so these are your 180 rounds per minute hand cannons and 140 round per minute hand cannons. They say that the range stat has now a more impact on minimum damage falloff for both archetypes. Damage falloff for 100 range now starts at 25 instead of 20 meters. So this is a buff to range, and I think it's a welcome change because hand cannons really got nerfed in terms of their range, and they're just not that competitive with auto rifles like Gnawing Hunger anymore. Precision hand cannons, which are the 180 rate of fire hand cannons, have had their magazine scaled up by 37%. I think this is a pretty interesting change, especially since weapons like Malfeasance have a huge magazine. I think that this change will really make 180s possibly a meta choice in PvE activities because of their large magazine, but we don't really know. On to lightweight hand cannons. So this is the biggest change, I think, that came out of this Sandbox update, and I think it's the one that's going to tear the community the most. So they've moved all lightweight hand cannons, which are the 150 rate of fire hand cannons, to the adaptive subfamily. Essentially, they're changing all 150 RPM hand cannons to 140 RPMs, and this includes Luna's Howl and Not Forgotten. They say one exotic hand cannon will retain its 150 rate of fire. We aren't going to leave it up to speculation. It's beautiful, it does solar damage, it makes enemies explode, it's sunshot. Ultimately, my personal opinion on this is that I don't like these type of changes. I don't like when Bungie tries to take away an entire archetype of weapons, and I think it hurts the diversity of the game. I'm also a little biased because I personally use 150 hand cannons the most. These are your Spare Rations, your Thorns, your Dire Promises, your Rose. These are some of the most competitive weapons and the most rampantly used hand cannons in all of Crucible, and I think completely eliminating them is not going to have many people happy. We'll have to see how this plays out in terms of the meta when Beyond Light hits, but right now it's not looking too great. So I guess if you want to use 150 hand cannons in Beyond Light, you're going to have to get used to using Sunshot. Next, sniper rifles. Bungie says we want sniper rifles to feel powerful without being so easy to use that they dominate. They've adjusted how aim assist is affected by sniper rifle zoom level. They say lower zoom scopes have less aim assist and higher zoom scopes have more, with scopes around 50 zoom being unchanged. So this is a really interesting change and sort of unexpected and unconventional. I think ultimately this is going to really change up the sniper rifle meta. The most popular sniper rifles are Beloved and Revoker, with the Revoker having about a 35 range stat, if I'm not mistaken, and Beloved having somewhere in the 40s. That's going to make these sniper rifles a lot less competitive. This is especially going to affect controller players that use aim assist a lot and rely on it to hit things like crazy snipes in competitive game modes. I also think this is going to make weapons like Eye of Soul, which have around 50 zoom, if I'm not mistaken, a lot more competitive in the Crucible mode, which is good. I want to see different snipers become more competitive, and I want to see a change up in the meta. Next, they talk about auto rifles. They say in Season of the Worthy, the adaptive archetype 600 RPM was given a buff. We're pulling that back a little to keep it in check with other auto rifle archetypes. So they say they reduced the damage per bullet from 15.75 to 14.25. They say, note, prior to Season 10, damage per bullet was 13.75. This is a really welcome change. The problem with buffing auto rifles so much is that it gave one of the easiest weapon types to use the most competitive time to kill, and that really hurt any other weapon of having a chance of being meta in the game. You see weapons like Gnawing Hunger and the Summoner dominating even against things like hand cannons, which take more skill to use because of their competitive time to kill, even without hitting crit shots. So this change is a really welcome change, and I think it'll help balance out the Crucible meta, because I really don't like that everyone's using Gnawing Hunger. Next, they talk about scout rifles. They say scouts have a reasonable time to kill and can't be adjusted too much without making them dominate the field, so we're making them a little easier to use. They say they've increased how much each point of aim assist stat widens the aim assist cone. Ultimately, my thoughts are that it's not going to really change the usage of scout rifles. Scout rifles just aren't meta on a lot of close-range maps, and they're only really useful on long-range maps like Equinox that no one's going to use and are getting taken away in Beyond Light. So I think they need to do a little bit more if they want to help scout rifles become meta. Next, they talk about rocket launchers, where they've increased the reserves by 1 to 2 rockets depending on an inventory stat. I really don't think this is going to change much. People just don't use rocket launchers in competitive playlists or use them in specifically PvE activities. There are just so many better options like Xenophage, like Whisper of the Worm, Sleeper Simulant, Falling Guillotine, that rocket launchers just aren't that meta, and I don't think this change is going to do much. Next, they talk about general changes to the meta, and these are really interesting. So first, they go over Outlaw. They say they've increased the reload stat bonus from plus 50 to plus 70. That's going to be really good. I think it'll make Outlaw a lot more of a desirable perk, because it really isn't right now. The most important thing, I think, coming from this Sandbox change is the change to Mountaintop. They've had a lot of community feedback, and they feel that it's a bit over the top in Crucible game modes, which is, I would say, a bit of an understatement. Here are the changes intended to address those points. They've reduced splash damage by 33%, they've increased impact damage such that total damage is 5% lower than before, and they've reduced projectile velocity multiplier from the micro missile perk from 1.4 to 1.2, so it's now 20% faster than other breach grenade launchers instead of 40%. They've also reduced the in-air accuracy. Now it has a significant projectile error while in the air of around 7 degrees without the Icarus Grip mod. So I have a lot of thoughts about this. I definitely think that Mountaintop needed a nerf because it was just too dominant in competitive game modes. Reducing the splash damage by 33% is really going to change the way people use this weapon, because the way it's used right now is that people shoot the ground next to a Guardian, and then they use mods like Quick Access Sling to switch quickly to things like Sunshot to one-tap your opponent. They've also, I think, the change to the speed, I think it should have been a little bit more, because I still think breach grenade launchers are really fast, so I think it maybe should have been on par with those grenade launchers, or maybe about 10% faster. I still think 20 is pretty fast. Lastly, the reduction in inner accuracy. I don't really know how to feel about this, because they say that the Icarus Grip mod will still have pretty good inner accuracy, so I just see a lot of players who use Mountaintop switching to Icarus Grip, not Quick Access Sling, and I don't know how this will affect the Sandbox that much. Ultimately, we'll just have to see with the new Sandbox coming in Beyond Light. Lastly, they talk about a big change to the Falling Guillotine, which is, as we know, the most meta weapon in PvE right now. They say they've reduced heavy attack damage by 24% to bring it in line with other swords. They say Falling Guillotine will continue to be slightly above average, just not to the extent that it is right now. And lastly, Bungie's introducing Adept Weapons into Trials of Osiris. This has been a pretty big request from the community, because Trials of Osiris came out really half-baked, and a big reason for that is that there's not a really good reward for going flawless, and it doesn't incentivize people to come back to the game mode once they've gotten all the rewards, or once they've gone flawless once or twice. So Bungie says Adept Weapons are going to differ from base weapons in that their masterwork will give them +3 to all alternate stats, and not just the specific masterwork of the weapon. That's going to be really interesting. It'll help buff stats across the board and make the weapons a little bit more competitive than they would have been if they weren't Adept. The next change I think is the most interesting. They say Adept Weapons can use either a standard weapon mod or a new Adept Weapon mod earned when going flawless. A unique Adept shader has been made for these weapons, and there's a picture also below. I don't think this shader is really that interesting. I think it actually looks worse than the original weapon design, but we'll have to see how it looks in-game. So the biggest change comes to the Adept Weapon mods. They say these mods come in two varieties. First are weapon stat boosts, which grant +10 to a particular stat, like a Masterwork would, for example, Adept Range, and they say some versions of these mods grant an improved bonus, but with a downside. For example, they say Adept Mag gives a +40 to magazine size and a -20 to handling. This, I think, is really interesting for the meta, and it's going to help create a lot of custom builds, especially with the weapon stat boost mods that'll help buff things like range. For example, on hand cannons that don't have a lot of range right now. I think it's going to really change up the meta, and I think this is a welcome change. For acquisition, Bungie says they're going to have different adept mods drop from the flawless chest every single week, and they will be on a rotation. This is really good for the player base because it'll incentivize players to come back and try to go flawless every single week because different mods will be available. So I think this is ultimately going to energize Trials of Osiris again, and I think it's a very welcome change. Alright guys, that's all we've got today for the big Sandbox changes coming to Beyond Light. If you're really interested in talking about it, drop a comment down below about what you think about this Sandbox change. And if you like the video and want more, go ahead and slap that like button and subscribe as well.